The final appeal filed. Is this really the last chance for Julian Assange to avoid extradition to the United States? After 4 years in the UK's Belmarsh prison, lawyers have renewed his appeal after the last was denied. But with Australian politicians stepping up their diplomatic efforts to have Assange released, could his fate now lie exclusively in Canberra's hands? I'm Antony Loewenstein, and today's newsmaker is Julian Assange. Since 2010, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has been fighting extradition from the UK to the US. He and his supporters fear the 175-year prison sentence he could and believe he would receive if charged under the Espionage Act. Now, in his native Australia, there are growing calls by Australian MPs and the Prime Minister for Washington to drop its case against Assange. From the Quad to AUKUS, Australia has proven an invaluable ally to the United States. That should give Canberra some leverage, but would it be enough to bring the WikiLeaks founder home? Here's a look now at why the U.S. is still pursuing Assange.
In 2010, the world was given a glimpse into the dark heart of the U.S. military. WikiLeaks, an online forum founded by Australian Julian Assange, published hundreds of thousands of classified documents for the perusal of the general public. The documents provided disturbing insight into the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, with detailed accounts of civilian casualties, military operations, and human rights abuses. Assange became an instant celebrity and a target.
The result of this and some of our other publishing activities has led not to the United States conducting a full and frank investigation into the abuses revealed, as other countries are doing, but rather an aggressive investigation into this organization.
Assange launched WikiLeaks in 2006 to encourage the leaking of information that he said was of public interest to fight government and corporate corruption. But Washington accused him of putting lives in danger. In 2012, to avoid extradition, the 51-year-old Australian citizen sought asylum in Ecuador's London embassy. After 7 years of isolation, Ecuador kicked him out, and Assange was arrested. He is currently being held at a prison just outside of London, where he awaits extradition to the US to face charges of espionage. He faces up to 175 years in prison if convicted. But a growing number of people are calling on the US to drop the case.
Excuse us, we can't use this day without calling for the freedom of Julian Assange. The extradition request for Julian Assange.
2 hours and not 1 month.
Take it easy, take it easy.
It's about Julian Assange, of course, but it's also about press freedom, all our freedoms, and the fact that he exposed a crime that I was horrified about, and he's the one in trouble, he's the one imprisoned, and yet he exposed a crime, a war crime, which no one's done anything about.
Australia, keen to avoid a diplomatic incident with its most powerful ally, was notably quiet throughout. Previous governments made it clear he'd received no support beyond standard consular assistance. But that ice is now thawing. Australia's new centre-left Prime Minister, Antony Albanese, has declared his support for Assange.
Enough is enough. This needs to be brought to a conclusion. It needs to be worked through. There is nothing to be served by his ongoing incarceration.
If the eccentric and divisive character is extradited and prosecuted in the US, the world will be watching how Australia responds.
Free! Free! Julian Assange!
So what will be the legal fate of Julian Assange, and will Australian diplomacy be able to save him? Joining me now to debate that are, from Dublin, Greg Barnes, a legal advisor to the Australian Assange campaign, And from Sydney is journalist and filmmaker Antony Loewenstein. He's also a contributor to the book, A Secret Australia, revealed by the WikiLeaks exposés. Let me begin with Greg. Greg, please, legally it is confusing because the High Court in the UK has said that Assange has no legal grounds to challenge the decision to extradite him, but we're now awaiting the outcome of a hearing where that decision is being appealed. Tell us what's likely to happen now.
Essentially what's happening is that there was an appeal lodged. One judge has said that appeal can't be heard. That decision is now being appealed to two judges, and so it will be up to them to decide whether or not the appeal can go ahead. If it doesn't go ahead, then what happens is that the case could head to the European Court of Justice, but that, of course, is quite conjectural in terms of whether the UK would wait for a decision from the ECJ or whether they would simply say, well, look, we're just going to extradite him because he's exhausted his domestic options.
Okay. What is your gut telling you is going to happen? What do you think is the most likely scenario?
Well, look, it's difficult to know. I mean, I just repeat what Stella Assange said last week, that there's confidence that two judges will, looking at this, will take a view that this appeal should be successful. But I think the real issue is that, and this has always been the case, this is a very political case. This requires a political resolution and requires a political resolution quickly, because otherwise it will keep going in the courts.
Okay. Let me turn to Antony. I think you mostly agree with that analysis, but we know this diplomatic effort is now underway. It seems, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to have stepped up slightly. So how powerful is that diplomatic effort in Australia right now? Prime Minister Albanese has said enough is enough before, but how far will they really go to actually stop his extradition and have him freed?
On the face of it, Australia should have a lot of leverage. We are a close US ally. We essentially are hosting more and more US military bases on Australian territory. And as you said, since the new Australian government came into office in May last year, Albanese, the Prime Minister, and various other ministers have talked about being enough is enough. However, and it's a very important however, the real concern here is that I'm the co-editor of an organisation called Declassified Australia, and one of our writers, Kelly Tranter, who's a lawyer, has done lots of freedom of information requests to the Australian government around this case. And the short version of this is that it certainly appears that the Australian government is willing to do two things. One, until potentially Assange is sent to the US and then some kind of deal is struck that maybe Assange is sent to Australia to maybe, after a trial, I might add, to potentially serve time here. But secondly, he's not willing to put appropriate political pressure on the US. Now, that's deeply disturbing for so many obvious reasons, not least for the fact that Julian Assange has been in a high-security British prison for 4+ years. And as I think Stella Assange has said, this is death by process. The point is, I fear that the Australian, UK, and US governments would be very happy if Julian Assange dies tomorrow. That would solve their problem no end. And as an Australian citizen and as a journalist who has known Julian since 2006, who has reported on and used WikiLeaks documents extensively in the last 15 or so years, that would be an absolute travesty. And I'm worried that our government is not doing nearly enough to get him back home.
Tell me, do you think that the Australian government could be acting somewhat duplicitously in this? Because you've intimated that they'd want Assange to die tomorrow if they had the choice, because he's caused Australia some damage too. And it would just make the whole process go away. It's not that they're a fan of his work. So are they trying to look like they're fighting for human rights on one side, while behind the scenes they just really don't care what happens to this man?
I mean, look, obviously, if he had Albanese here, he would say that he's concerned about Assange and he wants him home. But as you rightly say, as Albanese also says in the next breath, I don't support what he's done. Just to be clear, Assange has practiced journalism. It's journalism. He's received leaks from various people over the years and published them in various outlets and on the WikiLeaks website. So the Australian government, I think, and don't get me wrong, what we obviously don't know is what potentially Albanese and Joe Biden talk about privately. That's not possible to know. It is conceivable some deal is in the works. But as I said, based on documents that we, Declassified Australia, have discovered, it appears the Australian government is not willing to put appropriate pressure on the US to resolve this problem. And the fear, as I said, is that Assange himself is paying the price for that, because the ultimate issue here is not just Julian Assange, as awful as his predicament is. It's the fate of investigative journalism in general. If Julian gets sent to the US, it means that the US and its allies have the right to extradite any journalist whose work they do not like because they've embarrassed the US. That's ultimately what this is about.
I want to talk more about that in a minute, Anthony, but let me come back to Greg first, because Greg, you said specifically a few weeks ago you were very much looking forward to Biden and Albanese actually meeting in Sydney, where you had expected Assange to be discussed. So what was lost with that meeting's cancellation? And did you get any feeling that maybe Biden was happy to avoid it?
Well, I think he avoided it because of budget issues in the Congress, as we know. But the point is, and to pick up Anthony's point, that Australia has enormous leverage in relation to the US. Secondly, that the Prime Minister will be going to the US and meeting with the President later this year. So there's another opportunity to raise this case and to press it. But thirdly, what needs to be discussed is the fact that there is a precedent for doing this. When John Howard was Prime Minister of Australia, he got back home David Hicks, who was in Guantanamo Bay, an Australian citizen, found himself there because of political pressure in Australia. He prevailed on President Bush because Australia had been part of the coalition of the willing. Well, Australia is again part of a coalition, this time in relation to China containment. No one has signed up in greater detail or for more measures than Australia. So, the leverage is enormous. It's really a question of whether the government's prepared to use it. And it ought to be prepared to use it because about 78% of Australians, according to the latest polling, think Assange should be brought home. So, and furthermore, the opposition, led by Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, is also supportive of this case coming to an end. So this is a no-lose for Biden, for Albanese in pressing this matter as hard as he can with Biden.
Okay. Though, quickly, Greg, the U.S. has already given that assurance that if Assange is convicted in the United States, he could be transferred to Australia to serve out any sentence. So is there a possibility that delaying this extradition is actually just keeping him in arguably the equally terrible Belmarsh prison in the UK, rather than getting him moved to the US, getting the process over with, and then having him brought back to Australia where they can free him if they want to?
Well, there are two issues there. Firstly, you wouldn't trust the United States when it came to Assange stepping inside one of their prison cells because it is notoriously harsh, and he is a person who has attracted enormous ire in certain segments of the US, certain segments of US politics. Secondly, international prisoner transfers are a matter of discretion, and they can be delayed or they can happen quickly. And again, you'd be relying then on guarantees from the United States to say, oh, yes, if we get a request, we'll move on it quickly. Well, that may or may not happen. So he could find himself in a worse predicament if he does go to the United States.
Okay. Anthony, let me ask you this. I mean, as a journalist, you have the U.S. setting this example, proving to be very harsh with somebody they accuse via what you say is their journalism. They've used the Espionage Act to charge them with spying. Is the U.S. inadvertently maybe hurting itself? Because right now the U.S. is demanding the release of American journalists that are in Russia in particular. Russia's not budging, and they're saying that they're charging these journalists with spying as well. I mean, could that bode badly for the United States in setting an example like this with Assange?
It already is. I mean, China routinely talks about the Assange example, about American hypocrisy and Western hypocrisy. I mean, China clearly imprisons huge numbers of journalists and dissidents in a shameful way. But when the US tries to put pressure on Beijing, they say, yeah, but you've got Julian Assange rotting in a British prison. I mean, and it's true. Of course, that is absolutely correct. I mean, the idea that the US has any moral legitimacy to talk about free press. I mean, the US routinely has through the US State Department and indeed through its other outposts in Australia and the UK, conferences about freedom of the press and freedom of journalists, which are vital issues. But when you have one of the generation's leading journalists rotting in a British prison for the act of journalism, you're seen as a hypocrite, and rightly so.
Antony, tell us how you actually use WikiLeaks as a source for what you do, and how much you think the public has been able to gain from what you've been able to research through WikiLeaks. I mean, is there a real public interest in what WikiLeaks actually is?
As a journalist who's been working on a range of issues from the drug war to Palestine to Afghanistan to a range of other issues in the last 20 years, there's really no news organisation, and WikiLeaks is a news organisation, that has published more vital documents on the state of the world in the 20th and 21st century. So a few examples briefly. Lots of work in my recent book on the Palestine Laboratory looking at Israel's relationship with dictatorships in the last decades. WikiLeaks State Department cables that came out just over 10 years ago gave details about that. There were huge numbers of releases with the Afghan and Iraq war logs released in 2010 and 11, detailing huge numbers of US war crimes in both those countries. Clearly in the public interest. There's just no question about that information we did not know before that. And there's lots of court cases around the world in the last 10 or so years that have used WikiLeaks documents to prove certain issues one way or the other in terms of defending individuals. So there's no question this is of public interest. And there's a reason why before the Trump administration, Julian Assange had not been charged. The Obama administration called it a so-called New York Times problem, namely that if you charge Assange, you therefore would have to charge also the New York Times and the Washington Post and all the other US media, because they did exactly the same thing. They published those documents, and frankly, they use classified documents every single day. It's the question of whether it's a sanctioned leak or a non-sanctioned leak. And the WikiLeaks documents obviously upset America, but as a journalist, absolutely, they've been vital for the last 15 years of my work.
You know, Greg, as we heard, Stella Assange has been saying that he's being killed by the process. That's how it was phrased. He has suffered consequences to his mental health. But tell us, how much does the United States still fear that he could become active again, even seek, arguably, revenge if he is released?
Well, it's a good question. I suppose there are people in the United States who do think that. I mean, I heard Lindsey Graham, the leading Republican, on the weekend in one of the American outlets talking about Assange and Manning and Snowden in what could only be described as disparaging terms. But secondly, what I would say is that the fact that Julian's health has deteriorated so much means that at the end of the day, this is a case where humanity has to come into play, and that's one of the key cards that Anthony Albanese can play with President Biden. I mean, it's very unusual for an Australian High Commissioner to go and visit an Australian prisoner in London, but that's what Anthony Albanese had his new High Commissioner Stephen Smith do recently. So there's no doubt that the human side of this case has to be taken into account, and is something that the Australian government needs to press with the United States.
And it is interesting to have heard Albanese actually say that this is essentially a case of shooting the messenger. He even noted that Chelsea Manning has been released. I mean, she was the one who leaked the documents. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, her sentence was commuted. Didn't receive a pardon, but her sentence was commuted. So why are we going after the person, another person, in relation to the same set of facts? I think the other issue to take into account is the fact that in Australia at the moment, as Anthony will know, we are celebrating journalists from the 9 newspapers who have uncovered war crimes, alleged war crimes in Afghanistan. And in fact, there was a major defamation win by those newspapers in relation to one soldier recently, and allegations of war crimes. Now, on the one hand, we celebrate journalists who do that, and our governments are telling us they're going to set up a special prosecutors unit, which they've done, and we're going to, chase down these cases. On the other hand, what did Julian Assange do? Julian Assange clearly showed evidence of war crimes, most notoriously in the collateral murder video, but we find him banged up in Belmarsh prison, facing an effective death penalty of 170 years if he goes to the US. Again, the hypocrisy in this is enormous.
You know, Anthony, as far as Chelsea Manning is concerned, yes, in many cases, Assange did take these documents from other people. He is the messenger, not the leaker. But he's also being charged with hacking. Was there potentially a crime in that he basically broke into servers that were not his, stole information that was not his in an illegal manner? Is there something else that he could be legitimately, and I mean, I know you very much defend everything he's done, but is there a legitimate case here to say, no, he stole information in certain instances that was not his, that is breaking the law?
I mean, there's no evidence that he was hacking at all, either in what the US has alleged or others. And it's important to note here that what Assange was doing with Chelsea Manning and indeed a number of other sources is doing exactly what journalists do all the time. Speaking to sources, discussing with sources how to get the information from sources, trying to make it secure for those sources to try to protect them. This was not particularly unusual. I mean, any journalist you speak to who does this kind of work, in the New York Times, the Washington Post and others, if they're honest, will tell you exactly this. It's not particularly unusual what Assange was doing in the past or now. And it's why, for example, virtually every major journalism organisation in the West now has come out in support of Assange, demanding his release. This is including the New York Times, the Guardian and others as the newspapers that published.
Do you think they're speaking out loudly enough, though?
No, I don't. I mean, look, those newspapers have a lot of, in my view, complicity in the current situation, which is a separate issue we haven't got time to go into, but they should definitely be much louder, absolutely, because I think they benefited, not just in terms of their work, but financially from publishing WikiLeaks documents. They've not been nearly loud enough against this prosecution, and I think it has something to do with the fact that they're very supportive of Joe Biden, who's currently president. They were very much against Donald Trump, who, of course, began this ridiculous process, but Biden has done nothing to change that. And Biden, of course, himself, when these releases came out 15 or so years ago, called Assange a high-tech terrorist. That was a direct quote from Biden. So obviously there's a personal animosity between Biden and Assange. Not that they've never met, as far as I'm aware.
Right.
But that kind of animosity is real. But again, this is clearly about the US wanting to set an example and punish an individual and an organization that embarrassed them.
Okay.
That's what this is about.
There's also something underway, though, in the UK. You know, they have been drafting this new national security bill. Some complain that it lacks a public interest defense when it comes to journalism. So you alluded to this before, Anthony. Is investigative journalism actually starting to be criminalized? Or, I mean, is just the bar being set too low for journalism to qualify as espionage?
I think investigative journalism is definitely under attack, and not just in the West. I mean, there's countless examples in many countries where journalists are being arrested and tried and imprisoned and killed, tortured. I mean, the rate of that happening in the last years has never been higher, actually. And it does worry me that what the US is doing, what the UK is trying to do, and also I think there's under the guise, though, of operating in a democracy that somehow journalists have, free rein to do as they will. The truth is that actually I would say that not nearly enough journalists see the threat that the Assange prosecution presents. Yes, many have spoken out, and yes, many are campaigning for his release. That's undeniably true, but not nearly enough have. And I think because somehow they regard Assange as some kind of rogue figure, or he's a freelancer, or he's doing his own thing, or he doesn't show respect. I think it's jealousy. I've long thought this. I think a lot of it is professional jealousy. But I do feel concerned, really concerned, as some of my friends and colleagues do in the US and UK, of the increasing demand to criminalise investigative journalism and the lack of protections provided by the governments.
Greg, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I mean, I agree with that. I think the issue in the Assange case also is the extraterritorial reach of the US here. What they're trying to do is use domestic espionage laws to prosecute a person who is, one, not a US citizen, two, was not in the United States when these alleged crimes occurred. What this means is that not only Assange, if this prosecution is successful, but other journalists around the world, people like Antony and others, could find themselves on the end of an extradition request from the United States. Now, that is not far-fetched, because the way the law works is that governments are very keen to extend jurisdiction wherever they can, particularly in relation to so-called national security. So that is the other dangerous element of this particular case. But it is part of an overall trend where journalists, but not just journalists, I think more broadly, people who are concerned with ensuring that the public knows what is happening under the guise of national security and defence, are finding themselves continually threatened and increasingly threatened by draconian laws.
Okay. Greg, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank you and Antony both so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.